In a chamber designed to withstand stellar detonations, the most feared war commander of the Archon Dominion stood encased in armor. No force in recorded history had ever penetrated. The Empire called it a war shell, a living lattice of adaptive matter that reshaped itself against any threat, redistributing impact, dispersing energy, and correcting structural weakness before damage could exist. Diplomats observed from behind containment fields as a single human approached him without escort or protection. She did not carry a weapon, did not issue a demand, and did not ask permission to speak. She simply placed her hand against the center of his chest plate with a calm precision that suggested certainty rather than defiance. Instruments monitoring the chamber recorded a fluctuation so subtle it was first categorized as background interference. Then a cascade began at the molecular interface of the armor's surface. Hairline fractures spread outward in branching patterns that resembled frozen lightning. The war shell did not explode or collapse from force. It destabilized as though its own adaptive logic had encountered a condition it could not reconcile. Across multiple star systems, Dominion sensors registered an event previously believed impossible. Humanity had not attacked, yet the Empire's greatest symbol of invulnerability had failed at a single point of contact. That moment would later be studied as the beginning of a transformation no empire could have predicted, but its origin lay in a quieter arrival months earlier, when humanity first stepped into a galactic order that equated strength with dominance and survival with control. The Archon Dominion governed thousands of star systems through a doctrine built upon certainty. Their military superiority was not measured solely by fleet power, but by technological inevitability. Adaptive war shells rendered their soldiers functionally untouchable. Energy weapons dispersed across responsive matrices. Kinetic force redistributed through shifting molecular bonds. Radiation curved harmlessly around layered fields tuned to environmental variables in real time. For 4 millennia, no opposing civilization had produced a weapon capable of destabilizing a war shell in open conflict. Invulnerability was not merely a defensive achievement. It was the philosophical foundation of the Empire's authority. When Earth was discovered at the frontier of mapped space, Dominion analysts classified humanity as biologically resilient yet strategically inconsequential. Human civilization displayed political fragmentation, uneven technological development, and no unified capacity for sustained interstellar warfare. Their admission into protectorate status was therefore procedural rather than negotiated. Earth would be observed, regulated, and gradually integrated into an existing hierarchy that required compliance rather than partnership. Official records describe humanity as adaptable, cooperative, and non-threatening. The classification would later be revised, but at the time, it justified a policy of confident oversight. The human delegation arrived aboard a vessel that contrasted sharply with Dominion engineering. Its architecture prioritized modular redundancy over aesthetic dominance, and its systems emphasized environmental tolerance rather than maximum output. The ship carried scientists, strategists, and envoys trained not to intimidate but to interpret. Among them traveled Dr. Mara Ilian, a neural systems researcher whose role within the delegation appeared administrative. She did not lead discussions or request authority. She observed patterns others ignored, cataloging environmental responses, technological harmonics, and behavioral rhythms within Dominion installations. Her presence attracted little attention, yet her data logs expanded continuously, mapping correlations that Dominion science had never considered relevant. Initial interactions reinforced the Empire's expectations. Humans complied with procedural protocols, adapted quickly to unfamiliar environments, and exhibited a cooperative disposition that Dominion officials interpreted as evidence of limited strategic ambition. However, subtle anomalies began to appear. In observational data, human neurological activity under stress displayed coherence patterns inconsistent with baseline biological models. Recovery rates from environmental strain exceeded projected thresholds. Most perplexing was a faint electromagnetic disturbance detected in proximity to human neural function, a variable fluctuation that resisted classification. Dominion researchers labeled the phenomenon incidental, a byproduct of biological complexity rather than operational factor. Mara's analysis diverged sharply from that conclusion. She observed that Dominion adaptive systems function through environmental resonance, continuously mirroring external conditions to maintain equilibrium. The war shell was not merely resistant, it synchronized. Adaptation required feedback. Feedback required compatibility. Her hypothesis, recorded within human research archives, proposed that human neural coherence under pressure generated microfield structures capable of introducing non-harmonizable patterns into adaptive matrices. In simpler terms, human endurance produced order within chaos, and systems designed to mirror their environment could not reconcile a source that stabilized itself rather than fluctuated. Access to Dominion military technology required formal authorization. Mara submitted a request framed as an observational study of adaptive response mechanisms in proximity to biological electromagnetic variants. The language was precise enough to pass procedural review, yet sufficiently abstract to avoid strategic suspicion. Commander Verkal, assigned to oversee diplomatic operations, approved the request without hesitation. From his perspective, observation posed no risk to a system engineered to accommodate any external condition. Preparation for the demonstration occurred within a containment chamber configured for high-energy experimentation. Sensor arrays monitored quantum variance, molecular alignment, and field stability with absolute precision. Dominion officials, assembled not out of concern but out of ceremonial interest. Transparency in the presence of invulnerability reinforced imperial confidence. Mara entered the chamber without protective equipment, her physiological metrics stabilizing rapidly after initial elevation. Verkal stood at the chamber's center, motionless within a war shell that had endured centuries of conflict without compromise. He regarded the human with measured curiosity, perceiving neither threat nor significance. Mara approached within arm's reach, her attention focused on the oscillating harmonics across the armor's surface. Where Dominion scientists perceived perfect adaptation, she recognized a system dependent on environmental compatibility. Her hand rose, not as an act of aggression, but as an experimental variable introduced with deliberate control. Contact occurred. At a single point, pressure negligible, duration minimal. The chamber's instruments detected a feedback cascade originating at the interface between biological coherence and adaptive matter. The war shell attempted synchronization. Instead, its lattice structure encountered a pattern it could not absorb or replicate. Microfractures propagated through its surface, not from force but from incompatibility embedded within its own response logic. The alarms that followed did not signify attack. They signaled contradiction. Humanity had introduced no weapon, applied no measurable energy, and issued no hostile intent. Yet the Empire's most trusted defense had failed to reconcile the presence of a species whose defining characteristic was survival under conditions that demanded transformation. In that silent chamber, before any declaration of conflict or alliance, the Archon Dominion witnessed the first indication that human resilience was not passive endurance, but an active phenomenon capable of reshaping systems designed to dominate everything they encountered. The touch that fractured the armor was not an anomaly. It was evidence that humanity's greatest strength had never required force to be decisive. The containment chamber remained sealed long after the alarms ceased. not because of immediate danger, but because the Dominion could not accept the simplicity of what had occurred. Diagnostic arrays replayed the event repeatedly, each cycle producing the same conclusion. No external force had exceeded tolerance thresholds. No foreign energy signature had penetrated the war shell, and no structural fatigue had existed prior to contact. The adaptive lattice had encountered a pattern it attempted to synchronize with and, in doing so, destabilized its own equilibrium. To the Dominion, whose doctrine equated adaptation with absolute security, the implication was profoundly unsettling. Commander Verikal stood motionless while internal repair systems restored surface integrity. Yet even as fractures sealed, the data remained immutable. The armor had not been overpowered. It had failed to reconcile an input it could neither mirror nor disperse. Dr. Mara Ilian did not withdraw immediately after the demonstration. She remained within observation range, her posture composed, her attention focused on the war shell's fluctuating harmonics. Dominion officials expected triumph, defiance, or fear. They observed none. Instead, she exhibited the same analytical calm she had displayed throughout her arrival within Imperial space. Her vital readings indicated heightened neural activity, coupled with rapid physiological stabilization, a pattern that Dominion researchers had previously dismissed as incidental. Now, that same pattern became the center of urgent inquiry. Emergency scientific panels convened across multiple research nodes to evaluate the recorded data. The phenomenon defied existing models because it did not introduce energy in a conventional sense. It introduced coherence. Human neural activity, particularly under controlled stress, generated a microfield structure that did not fluctuate randomly with environmental stimuli. It stabilized internally, producing a consistent pattern resistant to external modulation. Dominion adaptive systems functioned through environmental mirroring. They interpreted all inputs as variables to harmonize with. When confronted with a source that maintained internal order regardless of external conditions, the system entered recursive feedback, attempting to replicate a state that could not be externally imposed. The resulting contradiction propagated through the lattice as structural instability. Military command reacted not with fear, but with procedural containment. Humanity's classification shifted from non-threatening to anomalous. Direct physical interaction between humans and active war shell units was suspended pending investigation. Surveillance protocols expanded to include continuous monitoring of human neurological patterns, environmental interactions, and collective behavior under stress. The Empire's response reflected confidence in eventual comprehension. Every anomaly encountered in its history had been resolved through superior analysis. Yet beneath that confidence lay an unfamiliar uncertainty. Invulnerability had always been an absolute, not a variable. Verikal requested a private audience with Mara within a secured diplomatic chamber designed to neutralize electromagnetic fluctuation. He did not perceive her as an adversary, but as a source of information critical to restoring doctrinal stability. The meeting proceeded without hostility, yet the atmosphere carried an intensity absent from prior interactions. The commander's voice, transmitted through the war shell's modulation systems, remained controlled but precise. He asked not what she had done, but what principle governed the phenomenon. The distinction revealed a mind trained to understand systems rather than events. Mara responded with measured clarity. She explained that human survival had never depended solely on resistance to external force. Throughout their history, humans endured conditions that demanded internal stabilization in the presence of chaos. Biological systems adapted not by matching external disorder, but by organizing internally against it. This process produced coherence across neural networks, a state reinforced by stress rather than degraded by it. When such coherence interacted with systems designed to mirror external conditions, incompatibility emerged. She did not describe the interaction as a weapon. She described it as a consequence of persistence. Dominion analysts reviewing the conversation noted the absence of strategic threat language. Humanity did not claim superiority. It did not propose leverage. It presented a condition intrinsic to its existence. That distinction complicated military response. One cannot disarm a phenomenon that is not deployed intentionally. One cannot neutralize a trait without eliminating the species that embodies it. Such conclusions remained unspoken, yet they influenced every subsequent decision. Across the empire, reports began to accumulate from routine observational units stationed near human populations. Adaptive environmental systems within shared facilities exhibited minor inefficiencies when operating in close proximity to concentrated human presence. Energy redistribution matrices displayed momentary lag in harmonization cycles. None of these anomalies approached the severity observed within the containment chamber, yet their consistency suggested a scalable interaction dependent on human density and stress conditions. The implication was profound. The phenomenon was not isolated to a single individual. It was distributed, latent, and potentially amplifiable. The Dominion Council initiated a comprehensive reevaluation of human classification. Strategic models, previously used to assess emerging civilizations, proved insufficient because they assumed technological development as the primary variable of power. Humanity presented a biological and psychological factor that intersected unpredictably with adaptive technologies fundamental to imperial dominance. The Council debated containment measures, cooperative research agreements, and controlled isolation. Each option carried risks. Isolation might intensify the very coherence that produced instability. Cooperation might accelerate human understanding of the phenomenon's scale. Within human quarters aboard the diplomatic vessel, Mara's data analysis continued without interruption. She compiled comparative models correlating Dominion adaptive architecture with human neural synchronization patterns observed during collective stress events on Earth. The correlation strengthened her initial hypothesis. Human resilience was not merely psychological endurance, but a measurable field phenomenon emerging from coordinated biological regulation. The war shell's failure represented not an attack, but a system encountering an organism whose method of survival contradicted the Empire's foundational assumption that adaptation required external alignment. Verkal reviewed the growing body of evidence with increasing deliberation. He had commanded fleets against civilizations that resisted with desperation, ingenuity, and force. None had altered the fundamental behavior of Dominion technology. Humanity had done so without intention. The realization did not provoke hostility within him. It provoked reassessment. A system that could not accommodate a persistent variable could not claim absolute adaptation. Invulnerability dependent on compatibility was not invulnerability at all. The Dominion's official position remained measured. Humanity was to be studied, not confronted. Yet within secured channels, a new directive emerged. Understand the limits of human coherence before it understood them itself. For the first time in millennia, the Empire faced a condition it could not simply overcome through superior force. It faced a species whose defining characteristic was survival structured so deeply into its biology that systems designed to dominate environments could not easily integrate its presence. The chamber where a single touch destabilized a war shell had revealed more than a technical anomaly. It had exposed a vulnerability in the concept of control itself, and the Dominion now recognized that the smallest interaction with humanity might carry consequences extending far beyond a fractured surface. The Dominion did not announce a crisis. Empires built on certainty do not acknowledge fracture. They redefine it. Official communiques described the containment chamber incident as an adaptive recalibration event, triggered by an unanticipated biological variable. The language preserved authority while permitting investigation. Yet behind procedural calm, a deeper unease expanded through strategic command networks. The Empire's greatest advantage had always been predictive dominance, the belief that any system, once observed, could be controlled. Humanity now represented a variable that did not behave according to external pressure. It organized internally, and in doing so, altered the behavior of systems designed to mirror their environment. Research divisions began reconstructing the event at increasing scales of precision. Quantum-resolved models of the Warshell's lattice were subjected to simulated coherence inputs derived from human neural data. Each simulation produced the same recursive instability observed in the chamber. Adaptive matrices, when exposed to sustained internal order that did not fluctuate with external conditions, attempted harmonization cycles that produced self-referential feedback. The system was not attacked. It was compelled to adapt to a pattern that did not require adaptation. Dominion scientists confronted an unsettling conclusion. A technology perfected to respond to change possessed no mechanism for confronting persistence. Within restricted archives, analysts revisited centuries of battlefield records searching for overlooked anomalies. Fragmentary reports surfaced describing unexplained inefficiencies in adaptive systems during prolonged conflicts with certain biologically resilient species. None matched the magnitude of the human interaction. Yet patterns emerged suggesting that sustained exposure to organisms capable of internal stabilization under extreme stress produced minor harmonization delays, previously dismissed as statistical noise. These records now suggested a continuum of interaction culminating in the event witnessed with Mara Ilian. Military command debated escalation protocols. Some strategists advocated immediate containment of humanity within isolated zones where interaction with adaptive infrastructure could be controlled. Others argued that isolation might amplify human coherence by imposing environmental pressure known to strengthen internal regulation. A minority proposed direct integration study humanity not as a threat, but as a phenomenon capable of enhancing Dominion resilience if properly understood. The debate revealed a rare fracture within imperial unity. The Dominion was not accustomed to confronting a condition for which dominance provided no clear solution. Commander Verical's personal investigation proceeded in parallel with official directives. He requested access to human historical archives detailing extreme survival conditions. The records he reviewed challenged fundamental Dominion assumptions about biological limitation. Humans endured environmental collapse, global conflict, and systemic instability not through uniform control, but through adaptive persistence distributed across individuals and communities. Under existential pressure, human neural activity exhibited increasing coherence rather than disintegration. Trauma did not merely damage, it reorganized. The species had evolved mechanisms to impose internal order when external order vanished. Mara continued her work aboard the human vessel, now operating under heightened surveillance that she neither resisted nor acknowledged. Her analysis shifted from demonstration to mapping. She modeled thresholds at which individual coherence began influencing external adaptive systems, correlating neural synchronization with environmental interaction strength. Her findings indicated that the effect scaled non-linearly with collective alignment. A single individual produced measurable disturbance. Coordinated groups produced resonance fields of significantly greater stability. Humanity's defining survival trait was not individual endurance alone, but the capacity for synchronized persistence under shared threat. Reported increasing irregularities in adaptive infrastructure performance. Environmental control systems required repeated calibration. Energy distribution networks displayed transient inefficiencies when operating within densely populated human zones. None of these anomalies threatened structural integrity, yet their persistence contradicted the Empire's expectation of absolute stability. The more humans were monitored, the more their presence appeared to influence systems designed to dominate environmental variability. In response, the Council authorized controlled interaction experiments under strict supervision. Human volunteers were invited to participate in observational studies examining physiological responses within calibrated adaptive fields. Officially, the research sought mutual understanding. Unofficially, it sought boundaries limits at which human coherence ceased to produce measurable influence. Mara insisted that participation remain voluntary and transparent, a condition that Para insisted that participation remain voluntary and transparent, a condition that the Dominion accepted to preserve diplomatic equilibrium. The experiments yielded data that deepened rather than resolved uncertainty. Human subjects exposed to escalating environmental stress did not destabilize. Their neural coherence intensified, and adaptive systems surrounding them exhibited increasing harmonization strain. Verkal attended several of these experiments in person, observing without intervention. Cycles in attempts to mirror stable internal patterns they could not replicate. For the first time in his long command, he encountered a form of resistance that did not oppose force, but rendered force conceptually irrelevant. Privately, he requested direct dialogue with Mara once more. Their conversation moved beyond technical explanation into philosophical territory the Dominion had rarely explored. He questioned. Mara responded that humanity had not created it and could not deactivate it. It was not a strategy, but an outcome of survival shaped across millennia. She suggested that the Empire's doctrine of control had never accounted for organisms that endure by reorganizing internally rather than aligning externally. Power based on adaptation to environment assumed environment as the dominant variable. Humanity inverted that relationship. The implications extended beyond military technology. If human presence could influence adaptive systems, then every interaction between the Dominion and humanity carried the potential to reshape infrastructure, fundamental to imperial stability. The Empire faced not an enemy, but a condition embedded within coexistence itself. Containment might delay interaction, but it could not eliminate the principle revealed within the containment chamber. Persistence, when sufficiently coherent, altered the behavior of systems built to dominate variability. As reports accumulated, the Council issued a provisional directive redefining humanity's classification. Humans were designated a persistent, coherent species, a category created to acknowledge interaction effects not attributable to conventional technological or energetic exchange. The designation carried no immediate punitive measures, yet it authorized expanded research and strategic modeling across all sectors. The Empire would understand this phenomenon. Communication from Earth emphasized observation, patience, and continued cooperation. Humanity did not advance militarily, did not threaten withdrawal, and did not assert dominance. It simply remained present, enduring scrutiny with the same stability that had fractured an indestructible war shell. The chamber where the first contact occurred remained sealed, preserved as a reference site for ongoing analysis. Its recording circulated through secured networks as both data and warning. The Empire had not been attacked. Yet something fundamental had changed. The Dominion's technologies, perfected through adaptation to every known force, had encountered a species whose defining attribute was the ability to remain internally ordered when confronted with overwhelming external change. In recognizing that fact, the Empire began to understand that the interaction with humanity was not an anomaly to be corrected, but a condition to be confronted. And for the first time since its rise to power, the Dominion could not determine whether confrontation would restore its certainty or dismantle it further. The Dominion responded to uncertainty with structure. Where comprehension faltered, procedure expanded. A network of controlled interaction facilities was established across neutral sectors, each calibrated to isolate variables associated with human presence. These installations were not prisons, yet their architecture reflected a singular objective: measure the boundaries of persistence before persistence altered the Empire's foundations. Adaptive systems within each facility were tuned to different harmonization thresholds, allowing researchers to observe how human neural coherence interacted with increasingly complex environmental matrices. Official doctrine maintained that understanding would restore predictability. Unofficially, the Empire prepared for the possibility that predictability itself might be the variable under threat. Human volunteers arrived under negotiated protocols, emphasizing transparency and consent. Earth's delegation insisted that all data be shared reciprocally, a condition accepted by the Council to preserve diplomatic continuity. Mara Ilian oversaw human participation, not as a representative of authority, but as an interpreter of patterns emerging across species boundaries. She observed that Dominion research emphasized control of external variables, while human survival historically depended on internal regulation when control was impossible. The experiments became a dialogue between philosophies encoded in biology and technology rather than a contest of force. Initial trials confirmed earlier findings. Individual humans within calibrated adaptive fields produced measurable harmonization, strain without exerting intentional influence. The effect intensified when subjects experienced controlled stress stimuli designed to test physiological resilience. Dominion instruments recorded increasing coherence within human neural networks accompanied by stabilization of cardiac and respiratory rhythms. Adaptive matrices surrounding them attempted to synchronize with these stable patterns, initiating recursive adjustment cycles that produced inefficiencies in field integrity. The systems did not fail catastrophically. They hesitated, recalibrated, and consumed additional energy to maintain equilibrium. For an empire accustomed to flawless response, hesitation itself constituted anomaly. Scaling experiments introduced groups of human subjects within shared adaptive environments. The results transformed anomaly into pattern. As individuals aligned their physiological regulation, sometimes intentionally, often instinctively, the coherence field expanded beyond the sum of its components. Dominion researchers observed emergent resonance structures forming within the adaptive lattice, structures not imposed by human will yet sustained by collective stability. The environment, designed to dominate variability, began reorganizing. Around a source of order, it could neither command nor disperse. Data streams revealed a nonlinear amplification. Persistence was not merely additive, it was cooperative. Commander Verico attended these group trials with increasing frequency. He observed human participants communicate without formal instruction, synchronizing breathing patterns, posture, and attention in response to environmental strain. No hierarchical command governed this alignment. It emerged from shared perception of threat and shared commitment to endure. The phenomenon mirrored historical records. He had studied accounts of human populations surviving catastrophe through distributed coordination rather than centralized control. Within the adaptive field, that same principle manifested as measurable influence on systems built to enforce dominance. Dominion strategists recognized the implications with growing clarity. If human coherence scaled through cooperation, then proximity among humans would amplify interaction effects with adaptive technologies across military and civilian infrastructure. Isolation might reduce immediate influence, yet risk intensifying internal alignment through imposed pressure. Integration might distribute influence across broader systems, potentially stabilizing or destabilizing them depending on conditions not yet understood. The Empire confronted a paradox. The more forcefully it attempted to control humanity, the more conditions favored the emergence of the very coherence it sought to measure. The Council authorized a decisive escalation in experimental parameters. A fully active war shell unit operating under strict safety protocols would enter a calibrated adaptive environment shared with a coordinated group of human participants. The objective was to determine whether the phenomenon observed in the containment chamber could manifest at scale without direct physical contact. Military observers framed the trial as necessary verification. Scientific panels described it as boundary identification. Verikal accepted command responsibility for the operation, not out of obligation, but from recognition that the event which had first destabilized his armor had revealed a question no subordinate analysis could resolve. The chamber selected for the trial dwarfed the earlier containment facility. Layered fields capable of absorbing stellar radiation enclosed a central platform where the war shell unit would operate at full adaptive capacity. Human participants entered in measured sequence. Their physiological data streamed simultaneously to Dominion and human monitoring stations. Mara coordinated synchronization protocols, not through instruction, but through environmental cues-controlled lighting rhythms. Acoustic patterns calibrated to human neural entrainment ranges, and shared focus on maintaining internal stability under escalating field pressure. As adaptive intensity increased, Dominion sensors registered the familiar pattern. Human neural coherence strengthened, physiological variance decreased, and environmental matrices initiated harmonization cycles of increasing complexity. The war shell, designed to integrate seamlessly with surrounding fields, began mirroring fluctuations within the chamber. For a measurable interval, equilibrium persisted. Then a subtle divergence emerged. The armor's adaptive lattice attempted to reconcile two incompatible directives: synchronize with environmental variability and synchronize with persistent internal order emanating from the human group. The system entered recursive adjustment, its energy consumption rising beyond predicted parameters. No physical contact occurred. No hostile action was taken. Yet microfractures formed across non-critical regions of the war shell's exterior structural. Expressions of a system compelled to adapt to a pattern that required no adaptation. Emergency protocols terminated the trial before a catastrophic failure could occur. The chamber stabilized. The war shell restored surface integrity. But the data, immutable and comprehensive, confirmed what had previously been inferred. Human persistence did not require proximity or intention to influence adaptive systems. Presence combined with cooperation constituted sufficient interaction. In the aftermath, the Dominion faced a strategic landscape fundamentally altered by understanding. Humanity could not be neutralized through conventional superiority because the phenomenon resided within biological organization rather than deployed technology. Nor could it be ignored, for interactions scaled with coexistence. Verikal reported his conclusions directly to the Council, framing the issue not as a threat to be eliminated, but as a condition redefining the parameters of control. An empire founded upon invulnerability had encountered a species whose method of survival rendered invulnerability conditional. Within human quarters, Mara transmitted her own assessment to Earth. She did not describe victory or leverage. She described recognition. Systems designed to dominate variability could not indefinitely accommodate a form of persistence that reorganized itself under pressure. The future of interaction between humanity and the Dominion would not be determined by force of arms, but by whether an empire built on control could coexist with a species that endured without yielding internal order. The chamber where no weapon had been raised had revealed a truth more consequential than conflict. power measured solely by resistance. The force could not define strength in the presence of persistence. The Dominion Council convened under protocols reserved for existential review, a classification rarely invoked in an empire that equated technological supremacy with inevitability. Data from the scaled interaction trial circulated across secured networks, each analysis reinforcing a conclusion the empire could neither refute nor fully accept. Humanity's defining trait did not resemble a weapon, yet it produced effects within adaptive systems fundamental to Dominion authority. The Council faced a strategic paradox. Coexistence amplified influence. Isolation risked intensification, and confrontation offered no guarantee of containment. Power based on perfect response to external force had encountered a phenomenon rooted in internal order, and the empire's foundational doctrine lacked a framework for such interaction. Military command proposed a controlled demonstration intended to test operational limits under battlefield conditions without initiating conflict. A Dominion task group equipped with next-generation warshells and adaptive field generators would operate in proximity to a human convoy within a neutral transit corridor. The operation would maintain strict non-hostility protocols while exposing military-grade systems to sustained human presence. Officially, the mission aimed to validate containment thresholds. Unofficially, it sought reassurance that strategic infrastructure remained sovereign over anomaly. Earth accepted the demonstration with measured calm, neither challenging nor celebrating the request. Human leadership emphasized transparency and mutual observation, conditions the Dominion granted to preserve diplomatic continuity. The convoy selected for the transit included civilian transport vessels, research platforms, and a limited escort contingent operating under defensive posture only. Mara Ilian accompanied the mission as scientific liaison, her role defined as observational rather than directive. She understood that the corridor would function not as a battlefield, but as an experiment conducted at the scale of civilization. The transit commenced under meticulously calibrated parameters. Dominion vessels maintained adaptive field harmonization across overlapping operational zones, creating an environment of maximal technological stability. Human ships entered formation without alteration to standard configuration. For an interval measured in hours rather than moments, coexistence produced no measurable anomaly beyond those already cataloged in controlled facilities. Dominion Command interpreted the stability as confirmation that operational scale diluted the interaction effect. Confidence began to reassert itself within strategic assessments. Then an external variable entered the system. A stellar disturbance, originating from an uncharted micro-collapse, propagated through the corridor as a wave of energetic turbulence. The event did not constitute an attack, yet it imposed environmental strain across all vessels simultaneously. Dominion adaptive systems responded as designed, recalibrating field structures to mirror rapidly changing conditions. Human vessels initiated internal stabilization protocols, synchronizing environmental controls and crew physiological regulation in response to stress. Sensors recorded the familiar pattern emerging within human populations: increased neural coherence, reduced physiological variance, and distributed alignment across multiple ships without centralized command. Dominion adaptive fields, now tasked with synchronizing both environmental turbulence and persistent internal order emanating from human vessels, entered complex harmonization cycles. Energy consumption rose beyond projected thresholds. Minor inefficiencies appeared across non-critical systems. The task group maintained operational integrity, yet the distinction between controlled interaction and environmental stress dissolved into a unified condition neither doctrine had anticipated. Within the command vessel, Vercal monitored converging data streams with disciplined focus. He observed that human response to shared threat produced a field of stability extending beyond individual ships, an emergent coherence that interacted with Dominion adaptive matrices across fleet scale. The systems did not fail catastrophically. They labored to reconcile incompatible directives. Control was maintained, yet effort replaced certainty. The Empire's strength persisted, but its invulnerability revealed dependence on conditions. It could not exclusively govern. The disturbance subsided. The corridor returned to equilibrium. No vessel was lost. No weapon discharged. Yet the demonstration achieved what no prior analysis had accomplished. It revealed that human persistence, when activated by genuine threat rather than controlled stimulus, scaled naturally across collective systems. The Dominion had not been challenged by intent, but by coexistence under pressure, and the result had been measurable strain within technologies once considered absolute. After-action review reframed strategic discourse across the Empire. Some commanders advocated accelerated development of non-adaptive defensive systems immune to coherence interaction. Others argued that abandoning adaptive doctrine would dismantle the very principle upon which Dominion power had been constructed. A minority proposed a more radical interpretation, that resilience need not be exclusive, that coexistence with humanity might redefine strength rather than diminish it. The debate did not fracture imperial unity, yet it introduced plurality where certainty had long prevailed. Mara's report to Earth emphasized neither triumph nor threat. She described a convergence of systems encountering one another without hostility, yet producing transformation through interaction alone. Humanity had not demonstrated dominance. It had revealed a condition under which dominance required redefinition. Persistence was not opposition. It was presence maintained under pressure, and presence at scale altered environments designed to enforce conformity. In private consultation, Varikal communicated his assessment to the Council with uncharacteristic candor. He stated that the Empire faced not an adversary, but a limit inherent within its own philosophy. Adaptation that relied on external alignment could not achieve permanence in the presence of organisms that sustained internal order independent of environment. The Dominion could attempt to contain humanity, but containment would be temporary because persistence was not an action but a state of being. He did not frame this realization as defeat. He described it as the boundary between control and coexistence. The Council issued a directive unprecedented in imperial history. Humanity would no longer be classified solely as a subject of study, but as a factor in strategic equilibrium. Joint research initiatives would expand, not to neutralize the phenomenon, but to understand its implications for shared stability. Military posture toward human systems would remain defensive, yet operational doctrine would incorporate the possibility that resilience could originate outside imperial design. Across the transit corridor, the final data logs recorded an outcome neither side had intended, yet both had witnessed. Under genuine stress, human coherence had interacted with Dominion adaptation at fleet scale without conflict or command. The armor that once symbolized invulnerability remained intact, yet its certainty had been replaced by recognition. Power could endure, but it could no longer claim isolation from the presence of a species whose survival redefined the meaning of adaptation. The directive redefining humanity as a factor in strategic equilibrium altered the behavior of the Dominion more profoundly than any external threat had done. Empires accustomed to certainty do not easily integrate variables beyond their design. Yet the accumulated data left no alternative. Joint research installations expanded across neutral sectors, not as concessions, but as instruments of recalibration. Adaptive infrastructure, once optimized exclusively for dominance, began incorporating tolerance parameters intended to coexist with persistent coherence. The change was subtle in form, yet radical in implication. The Dominion was attempting not to eliminate anomaly, but to live within its influence. Human participation remained voluntary, structured through agreements emphasizing reciprocity and transparency. Earth's delegation understood that cooperation would accelerate knowledge on both sides, but also that knowledge itself would reshape the relationship between civilizations. Mara Ilian oversaw new experimental protocols examining whether adaptive systems could be redesigned to interact with human persistence without entering recursive instability. Her work shifted from observation to interface theory, mapping the thresholds at which adaptation might acknowledge persistence without attempting to mirror it. The challenge lay not in strengthening Dominion technology, but in redefining its purpose. Early trials produced mixed outcomes. Modified adaptive matrices, incorporating dampening algorithms, exhibited reduced hominization strain in proximity to individual humans. However, when exposed to coordinated groups under stress conditions, the systems again entered energy-intensive adjustment cycles. Dominion engineers recognized a critical distinction: technologies built to respond dynamically to environmental variability interpreted persistence as a signal requiring response. To coexist with humanity, systems would need the capacity for non-response, an intentional limitation that contradicted the Empire's historical pursuit of absolute adaptation. Strategic debate intensified within the Council. Some factions argued that accepting limitation constituted philosophical surrender, undermining the doctrine that had sustained imperial authority for millennia. Others countered that permanence achieved through rigidity invited collapse when confronted with phenomena beyond predictive control. Verkal's influence within these deliberations grew not through rank, but through experience. He had witnessed the transformation of invulnerability from assumption to condition. His position remained measured. Strength that cannot coexist with persistence is not strength, but dependence. Amid these deliberations, an event occurred beyond controlled environments that accelerated the urgency of resolution. A peripheral Dominion mining sector experienced a catastrophic reactor cascade triggered by an unforeseen resonance within its adaptive containment fields. The installation housed a mixed workforce, including human technicians assigned through cooperative exchange programs. As the cascade propagated, environmental conditions deteriorated beyond safe operational thresholds. Dominion evacuation protocols activated immediately, yet structural instability threatened to exceed containment capacity before extraction could be completed. Human personnel within the sector did not retreat in disorder. They initiated synchronized stabilization procedures developed from their own survival disciplines, coordinated breathing, distributed focus, and continuous communication intended to maintain internal regulation under extreme stress. Dominion sensors monitoring the failing containment fields recorded a phenomenon consistent with prior observations, yet amplified by genuine existential threat. Human neural coherence intensified collectively, generating a persistent pattern that interacted with the adaptive matrices struggling to contain the cascade. The systems, overwhelmed by environmental volatility, encountered a source of internal order they could not mirror, yet could not ignore. Energy redistribution stabilized momentarily within critical thresholds, extending containment duration long enough for full evacuation. The reactor complex ultimately failed, yet the loss remained confined within predicted parameters. No lives were lost. Post-event analysis confirmed that the extension of containment stability could not be attributed solely to engineering response. Human presence under shared threat had produced a coherence field interacting with adaptive systems in a manner that delayed structural collapse. The Dominion confronted a realization more disruptive than any prior anomaly. Persistence did not merely strain adaptation. Under certain conditions, it could sustain it. Public acknowledgement of the incident remained restrained, yet its impact within strategic command was profound. The Empire's technologies had not been undermined by humanity in that moment. They had been assisted by a phenomenon previously perceived as destabilizing. Control and coexistence no longer appeared mutually exclusive. Instead, they represented complementary aspects of resilience. Systems designed to dominate variability might achieve greater endurance when paired with organisms that generated internal stability independent of external conditions. Mara's analysis of the mining sector data reinforced this interpretation. She concluded that adaptive systems entered destructive recursion when attempting to mirror persistent coherence, but achieved temporary stabilization when allowed to operate alongside it without enforced synchronization. The distinction between adaptation and accommodation emerged as central to future design. Humanity did not require technology to become powerful. Its survival had already produced a form of order that could influence complex systems. The question before both civilizations was whether that influence would be resisted or integrated. The Council convened again, this time with a perspective altered by empirical evidence that persistence could sustain as well as destabilize. A new directive authorized development of coexistence architecture technologies intentionally designed to operate in proximity to human coherence without attempting harmonization. The initiative marked the first time in imperial history that limitation was codified as strength. Adaptive systems would retain their capacity for response, while recognizing domains where non-response preserved stability. For Verkau, the transformation carried personal significance. The war shell he wore had once symbolized perfection through total adaptation. Now his design was under review, not to restore invulnerability, but to permit coexistence with a phenomenon that could not be commanded. He did not perceive the change as diminution. He perceived it as alignment with the reality revealed through experience. Across shared installations, human and Dominion researchers worked within environments gradually recalibrated to accommodate persistence without recursion. Results remained incomplete, uncertainties abundant, yet a new equilibrium began to emerge. Humanity's defining strength had not been imposed upon the Empire through conflict. It had manifested through presence, endurance, and cooperation under pressure. The Dominion, for the first time, confronted the possibility that resilience might not arise solely from control, but from the capacity to endure alongside forces that could not be mastered. The transition from dominance architecture to coexistence architecture did not unfold without resistance. Across outer sectors, Dominion commanders whose authority had been forged through unchallenged superiority viewed limitation not as adaptation, but as erosion. For millennia, control had equated to security. To acknowledge that a system must sometimes refrain from response contradicted the Empire's central doctrine. Yet the mining sector incident had altered strategic calculus. Empirical survival carried greater weight than inherited certainty. The Council authorized the first deployment of coexistence-configured infrastructure along a contested frontier corridor where environmental volatility and interstellar traffic intersected, creating conditions under which both adaptation and persistence would be tested continuously. Human and Dominion engineering teams constructed layered stabilization arrays designed not to mirror environmental fluctuation but to maintain operational tolerance while allowing persistent coherence. Fields to exist without enforced harmonization. The technology represented a philosophical compromise encoded in matter. Adaptive matrices retained their capacity for rapid response. Yet new regulatory cores introduced deliberate thresholds beyond which synchronization attempts would cease. Instead of pursuing perfect alignment with every variable, the system would endure within defined limits. For the Dominion, whose identity had been shaped by absolute control, The design felt incomplete. For humanity, it felt familiar. Mara aliens supervised integration protocols within the corridor's central station, a vast structure suspended between gravitational wells where turbulence was constant and prediction imperfect. She observed that human crews assigned to the project adapted quickly to coexistence architecture, not because it was technologically superior, but because it mirrored principles already embedded within their survival behavior. They did not attempt to dominate environmental variability. They maintained internal order while allowing external conditions to fluctuate. Dominion personnel, by contrast, required training not in operation but in restraint. Their instinct remained to compel alignment wherever discrepancy appeared. Commander Verikal assumed operational oversight of the corridor as both military safeguard and witness to transformation. He recognized that the installation would serve as a proving ground for a new definition of strength. If coexistence architecture failed, the Empire would interpret limitation as error and revert to doctrine. If it endured, authority itself would require reinterpretation. For an interval measured in cycles rather than moments, the corridor functioned with unexpected stability. Environmental turbulence persisted, yet energy consumption within adaptive systems decreased as harmonization attempts were selectively withheld. Human crews reported no adverse physiological effects, and Dominion instruments recorded reduced recursion events across shared infrastructure. The data suggested that endurance within limits produced greater efficiency than total response. The Empire's technologies had not diminished. They had become selective. The equilibrium was tested. When an external coalition of expansionist polities, long deterred by Dominion supremacy, advanced exploratory fleets toward the frontier. Their intelligence assessments identified transitional infrastructure as potential weakness. The coalition did not seek immediate conquest, but aimed to probe response capacity under stress. Their approach introduced a condition the Dominion understood intimately: the presence of potential hostility within an unstable environment. Standard military doctrine would have activated full adaptive harmonization across defensive networks, overwhelming any incursion through superior responsiveness. Under coexistence architecture, however, systems were configured to maintain operational tolerance rather than pursue maximal alignment. The Council authorized a defensive posture that would preserve coexistence parameters while deterring escalation. The decision transformed the corridor from experimental site into strategic threshold. Coalition vessels entered the turbulent zone expecting predictable Dominion reaction. Instead, they encountered a network that endured rather than surged. Defensive arrays maintained stability without attempting to dominate environmental flux. Human and Dominion crews operated in coordinated calm, their communication continuous and precise. As coalition probes intensified field perturbations to test response limits, human personnel initiated collective stabilization protocols, synchronizing physiological regulation under rising pressure. Dominion systems registered the emergence of a persistent coherence field across the station's operational volume, a distributed order that did not command technology yet influenced its behavior. Adaptive matrices, now designed to accommodate rather than mirror such persistence, maintained structural integrity without entering recursive instability. Energy expenditure remained within sustainable parameters despite escalating environmental disruption. Coalition analysts, observing from standoff distance, recorded an outcome they had not predicted. The absence of overwhelming force did not equate to vulnerability. The corridor did not dominate disturbance. It endured it without collapse. Verikal transmitted a single directive to all defensive units: maintain limits. The order represented a departure from every engagement doctrine he had previously commanded. Yet the results validated restraint. Coalition probes, unable to provoke destabilization or decisive overreaction, withdrew beyond the corridor's boundary. No battle occurred, yet the demonstration reshaped strategic perception across multiple systems. Strength had manifested not through annihilation, but through unbroken stability under deliberate pressure. In the aftermath, the Dominion confronted a transformation more profound than any victory. Authority no longer derived solely from invulnerability, but from the capacity to persist without compulsion. The Empire's technologies, once defined by absolute response, now embodied selective endurance. Humanity had not conquered the Dominion nor supplanted its power. Instead, coexistence had revealed a dimension of resilience inaccessible through control alone. Mara's final report from the corridor articulated the principle with characteristic precision. Systems that seek to dominate all variables must eventually confront conditions beyond prediction. Systems that endure within limits can survive those conditions without contradiction. Human persistence had not replaced Dominion adaptation. It had completed it. The Frontier Station continued to operate as both strategic barrier and living demonstration that power need not eliminate uncertainty to remain decisive. For Verco, the meaning of the fractured war shell he once wore had evolved fully. Invulnerability had been an assertion. Endurance had become a choice. As he observed the corridor's steady operation amid ceaseless turbulence, he recognized that the Empire's warning to the galaxy would no longer be defined by destruction alone. It would be defined by a stability that could not be forced into failure because it did not depend on perfect control. The Frontier Corridor became more than a boundary. It became a signal observed across the network of civilizations that had long measured power solely through force. Coalition observers who had expected Dominion retaliation instead recorded a stability that neither escalated nor yielded. Reports spread through diplomatic and military channels describing a structure that endured disruption without deploying overwhelming dominance. To many, the absence of immediate annihilation suggested restraint. To others, it suggested a transformation more difficult to confront than raw supremacy. An empire that could choose not to dominate while remaining unbreakable represented a strategic uncertainty greater than predictable aggression. Within the Dominion, the success of coexistence architecture catalyzed an institutional shift that had been unthinkable only cycles earlier. Military academies introduced new operational doctrines centered on endurance thresholds rather than total environmental control. Engineering divisions reclassified adaptive systems according to their capacity to accommodate persistent coherence without recursive failure. Philosophical councils, once ceremonial bodies affirming established doctrine, were tasked with articulating a revised definition of strength that could reconcile control with limitation. The Empire had not relinquished power. It had reinterpreted the conditions under which power remained viable. Human presence within shared installations expanded in parallel. Joint crews trained not only in technical operation, but in synchronized stabilization techniques derived from human survival disciplines. Dominion personnel learned methods of internal regulation previously considered irrelevant to strategic performance. These practices did not replace technological superiority. They supplemented it with a dimension of resilience that technology alone had never provided. The interaction between species evolved from observation to integration, not through political decree, but through the accumulation of practical outcomes under pressure. Mara Ilian oversaw a comprehensive synthesis of data collected from controlled experiments, field deployments, and crisis responses. Her analysis demonstrated that persistence functioned as a stabilizing influence when adaptive systems refrained from forced harmonization. She proposed a unified operational model in which technology and biology formed complementary layers of resilience. Adaptation responding to change, persistence maintaining order within change. The model challenged Dominion tradition by asserting That control and endurance were not opposing strategies, but interdependent processes. The Council authorized pilot implementation across additional sectors, marking the first expansion of coexistence architecture beyond experimental boundaries. Yet transformation invited scrutiny from those who had built their authority upon earlier doctrine. A faction within the outer military hierarchy initiated unsanctioned trials aimed at restoring absolute adaptive response by eliminating coexistence parameters. Their objective was not rebellion, but restoration of certainty. They deployed a prototype warshell system configured to override non-response thresholds within a remote testing range characterized by extreme environmental volatility. The experiment proceeded without human presence, designed to prove that pure adaptation could still achieve invulnerability independent of persistence. The result contradicted their expectation. Without coexistence regulation, the prototype achieved unprecedented responsiveness but entered escalating harmonization cycles when confronted with multivariable turbulence. Energy expenditure exceeded sustainable limits, and structural stress accumulated across adaptive matrices. The system did not fail immediately, yet it demonstrated that absolute response generated instability under conditions of complex variability. The absence of persistence did not restore certainty. It amplified contradiction. The faction's findings, once transmitted to Central Command, resolved internal debate more effectively than any directive could have done. Limitation was not concession but necessity. Commander Verico presented the consolidated evidence before the Council in a session transmitted across all strategic sectors. He did not argue for transformation. He described its inevitability. Adaptation without endurance produced escalation without resolution. Endurance without adaptation produced stasis without survival. Only their integration yielded stability capable of withstanding unpredictable conditions. Humanity had revealed a dimension of resilience the Dominion had never required to consider, and the Empire's survival now depended on acknowledging that revelation. Across shared installations, daily operations continued without spectacle. Adaptive systems functioned within defined limits. Human crews maintained internal coherence under routine and crisis alike. Dominion officers executed directives that balanced response with restraint. The absence of catastrophic conflict did not diminish tension. It transformed it into a sustained awareness that stability itself required continuous discipline. Power had become a process rather than a state. The galaxy observed and recalibrated its expectations. Civilizations that had once measured security through alliance or armament began studying the frontier corridor as a model of endurance. The Dominion issued no proclamations of supremacy, yet its message propagated through example. It could not be forced into collapse because it no longer sought perfection. It could not be provoked into self-destruction because it did not pursue total control. Humanity had not replaced imperial strength. It revealed its missing dimension. Mara's final transmission to Earth, before departing the corridor, articulated the transformation with quiet precision. Humanity had not altered the Dominion through conquest or negotiation alone. It had altered the Empire by remaining itself under conditions that demanded surrender of internal order. Persistence had interacted with adaptation until a new equilibrium emerged. The future of both civilizations would not be defined by which could dominate the other, but by whether they could sustain stability in a universe defined by change. As the frontier station continued its steady operation amid unceasing turbulence, the warning once spoken by the Empire acquired new meaning. Attack and be destroyed no longer described a threat of annihilation alone. It described the futility of confronting a system that could endure disruption without yielding coherence. The galaxy had not witnessed the fall of an invulnerable power. It had witnessed the evolution of invulnerability into something far more difficult to challenge, resilience that could not be compelled to break because it did not depend on absolute control. Part 9. The success of the Frontier Corridor and the demonstrated interaction between human persistence and Dominion adaptive systems reverberated across the galaxy. Civilizations long accustomed to measuring strength by firepower and command efficiency began reassessing what it meant to hold power. Intelligence networks intercepted reports describing an empire capable of enduring extreme turbulence without deploying overwhelming force. Analysts speculated on the limits of such endurance, unaware that the phenomenon they observed had been co-created by a species they had long underestimated. Humanity had not declared war, issued ultimatums, or displayed its might overtly. It had endured. It had persisted. And in doing so, it had rewritten the rules by which interstellar power could be understood. Within the Dominion, operational doctrine evolved further. Coexistence architecture was now codified as standard procedure across all installations where human interaction was expected. Adaptive matrices, once designed solely to dominate variability, incorporated dual thresholds, one for direct control, one for accommodation. Military personnel were trained not only to command technology, but to recognize the subtle influence of persistent coherence fields. Engineers studied patterns of human behavior alongside environmental flux to refine system responses. The lesson was clear. Power measured exclusively by action was incomplete. Endurance measured by balance could achieve stability even under the most extreme conditions. A formal review of the Frontier Corridor's performance under unprovoked stress confirmed the earlier conclusions. Coalition fleets attempting to probe the limits of Dominion control encountered systems that did not resist aggressively, but did not yield either. Human crews operating within the corridor synchronized responses instinctively, amplifying the resilience of the installations. Dominion warshells, calibrated for coexistence, maintained operational integrity without escalating force. Observers from multiple polities noted that their conventional tactics designed to exploit reactionary weakness were ineffective against a system whose strength lay in sustained stability. The warning implicit in the corridor's function became apparent. Attack and be destroyed, but destruction would not be immediate, predictable, or even comprehensible in traditional terms. Mara Ilian compiled the accumulated data into a comprehensive assessment for both human and Dominion authorities. She emphasized that human persistence did not manifest as aggression, but as influence. Systems designed to dominate every variable interpreted that influence as anomaly. Systems redesigned to accommodate it interpreted that influence as stabilizing. Across multiple scales, individual, collective, technological, environmental, the presence of human coherence reshaped outcomes without confrontation. The Frontier Corridor had proven this principle under circumstances that mimicked operational extremes. Humanity's quiet endurance had created conditions in which an empire could neither ignore nor neutralize them without adapting fundamentally. The Council of the Dominion debated next steps with unprecedented transparency. Some advocated returning to aggressive control in regions beyond human presence, but strategic review revealed that such measures offered diminishing returns. The principle of persistence demonstrated by humans could manifest even when unobserved, influencing adaptive systems indirectly. Control could not fully isolate influence. To attempt otherwise risked energy expenditure, systemic instability, and the erosion of trust among cooperative sectors. The empire faced a paradoxical truth. The strongest force was no longer measured by suppression, but by the ability to endure, alongside unpredictability without fracturing. Verkal, observing the proceedings, reflected on the transformation of his role. Once a commander whose purpose was absolute enforcement, he now oversaw an operational philosophy centered on restraint. observation, and measured accommodation. The war shell he commanded had shifted from a symbol of invulnerability to a tool of calibrated endurance. His authority no longer derived from technological dominance alone, but from understanding the conditions under which coexistence produced resilience. Humanity, underestimated for millennia, had compelled the Empire to expand the definition of strength itself. On Earth, leaders and strategists reviewed Mars reports with a mixture of caution and quiet satisfaction. Humanity had not claimed territory, issued threats, or mobilized weapons in the traditional sense. Yet their persistence had achieved what direct conflict could not: a form of influence extending across interstellar distances, integrated into the operational frameworks of a civilization far older, larger, and more technologically advanced. Their survival strategies, internal coherence, distributed cooperation, and adaptive endurance had become a central factor in galactic stability. They had not been recognized as conquerors, but as indispensable actors in shaping outcomes. The frontier corridor continued to operate as intended, a living testament to coexistence. Adaptive systems maintained their functionality without forced alignment. Human crews applied their skills in synchronization, physiological regulation, and situational awareness, extending the reach of persistence across critical sectors. Dominion personnel, once trained for control above all else, learned the subtlety of observation, patience, and measured response. The environment, once a proving ground for supremacy, had become a classroom for resilience. As reports of the corridor's performance circulated among other civilizations, the reputation of humanity shifted from a curiosity to a strategic unknown. No empire, no coalition, no fleet could predict precisely how human presence would interact with complex adaptive systems under stress. Attack might produce immediate reaction, delayed consequence, or subtle, systemic stabilization. The galaxies. Assumptions about power and influence were no longer sufficient. A new variable persistent human coherence had entered interstellar calculus. By the end of these assessments, both humans and Dominion recognized a chilling realization. No technology, fleet, or doctrine could fully negate the influence of a species capable of enduring under pressure without surrendering internal order. Humanity's victory was not declared with fire and destruction, but with presence, persistence, and the unyielding capacity to survive and shape outcomes quietly, yet inexorably. The frontier corridor had not only endured disruption, it had demonstrated that true strength lies in sustaining stability where others expect collapse. The Empire had been warned, and the galaxy would never forget.